Welcome to The Ride Inside with Mark Barnes, a podcast about the mental, emotional, and social aspects of motorcycling, brought to you by the Bmw Motorcycle Owners of America and the Moa Foundation. Mark Barnes is a clinical psychologist and motojournalist with decades of experience in both fields. But nothing in this podcast should be considered a way to diagnose or treat mental illness. We're all just trying to get through this thing called life, and motorcycles are one of the ways we do it. If you're in a crisis, or ride a KTM, please seek professional help. We'd love to answer your questions too, so send them to podcast@bmwmoa.org.
Welcome to the Ride Inside podcast. I'm Mark Barnes, and this essay is entitled ZEN and the R1250RS, An Inquiry into Quality. First, my apologies for writing something nonsensical to much of my readership. This one's going to be a little hard to follow for those who haven't read Robert Pirsig's famous book, ZEN and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which carries the subtitle, An Inquiry into Values, and his much later follow-up, Lila, An Inquiry into Morals. Maybe the percentage is higher among MOA members, but in my informal polling over the years, I found virtually every motorcyclist knows of this book, but few have completed the arduous journey of actually reading it cover to cover. Fewer still could articulate what Pirsig was trying to say. It's a challenging tome, to be sure, and Lila is even more difficult, since it lacks motorcycling stories to help a rider persevere through the dense philosophical expositions. I'll do my best to explain the bits I reference, but there's no way I can do them justice here, partly because of my own limited memory and understanding. There's also no way I can do justice to my own experiences with the R1250RS, a magnificent feat of Bavarian engineering I'm honored and humbled to now have in my garage. Although I admired this model from afar for years, we only became physically involved last month. The encounters since then have left me uncharacteristically speechless. I could easily ramble about the multitude of individual factors I found thrilling and delightful, but such a love letter would fall short of what I really wish I could put into words. There's something deeper, more essential, indeed quintessential, about this machine that continues to elude me like a mysteriously exotic lover who provokes my desire with nothing but misty hints and veiled clues. I've owned and ridden a multitude of motorcycles over the past half-century, none of which have had quite this same effect on me. Many were cutting edge for their time and genre, and most were unquestionably well-engineered, with excellent performance, reliability, and aesthetics. Obviously, I felt more affection for some than others, but in each case I could provide a reasonably good accounting of the contributing factors. There were bikes that delivered exhilarating acceleration, handled with incredible grace, were packed with fascinating and innovative technology, or perpetually rewarded my eyes and cerebrum with artfully crafted and startlingly clever design. All of those features are certainly present in the RS, yet something even more fundamentally important is still missing from the list. What, then, is this impalpable quality? Quality. No, not just an itemized element, as in something has this or that quality, but a category in its own right. Also more than just a consumer rating, like this is a higher quality product than its competition, although that's closer. I guess I mean quality with a capital Q, which could have myriad meanings, yet is inherently the same recognizable aspect across all applications. Sounds familiar. Where have I encountered this before? Of course, it's the central concern of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And, just as I have struggled to capture this element in language, Pirsig found the task relentlessly, maddeningly, in both meanings of that word, compelling, and ultimately impossible. He concluded quality is a feature we perceive instantaneously, without analysis or any other conscious logical processing. Linear verbal conceptualizations cannot define or explain it without doing violence to it. We can only talk around it with incomplete and necessarily inaccurate metaphors and analogies. When we do try to account for it intellectually, we're really just rationalizing a foregone conclusion. Pirsig's metaphysics of quality is an intricately elaborate effort to integrate an assortment of monistic, both Eastern and other, philosophical principles in contrast to the dualistic foundations of Western thought. Given our lifelong immersion in the latter, it is a disruptively mind-bending ordeal to make the leap into such a radically different perspective. Pirsig's own enlightenment came with much painful, almost lethal, thrashing around, a kind of torture his readers get to share all too vividly. While his books can be read as narrative literature, with character development, plot arcs, etc., they are only slightly fictionalized autobiographies in which he spells out his life's work as a thinker who fled, or was ejected from, the hallowed confines of academia, where he was increasingly frustrated by the limits and contradictions of what he'd learned and taught. His pursuit of a more comprehensive truth, with a capital T, drove him crazy, literally, and later propelled him to piece together an approach to life he felt had more intellectual and moral integrity. In it, he came to view quality as not some ethereal consideration, but the central driving, organizing force of the universe. Deep, yes, and a universe beyond the scope of this essay. Back to the RS. The part of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance relevant to my enthrallment is Pirsig's assertion that quality, with that capital Q, is a perception preceding rational thought. It's worth noting he generally equates quality, good as a noun, and value. We perceive something and recognize its quality, goodness, value immediately, at least to the extent we can grasp the object, relationship, process, idea, whatever. We may not appreciate something's quality until we achieve a fuller or clearer perception of it. The RS manifests quality at some broad strata beneath any specific details I could enumerate or quantify. Even more abstract categorical descriptors like elegant or sophisticated don't reach the goal, despite their accuracy. This is not to say I consider the RS perfect. It's definitely not. I'm seriously intimidated by, and therefore hate, its weight. I expect it will ravage my checkbook mercilessly, even if I avoid dropping it. I resent how much of a chore it will be to replace its thin, hard grips while preserving their heating function, or make any other modification not officially sanctioned and facilitated by its manufacturer. I could go on. Yet alongside my list of complaints, and much longer list of accolades, there's a phantom column containing only one item: quality. Every time I gaze at it, touch it, interact with it in the garage or on the road, or simply savor the pleasure of riding it, my perception is always saturated with a sense of quality. Before I get to any technical feature, performance aspect, bodywork contour, visceral sensation, or other specifiable dimension, I feel something akin to awe. In a previous column, entitled, "Oh, Now I Get It," I wondered if I had only realized upon buying the RS what BMW's faithful have known all along. However, I'd ridden other charming Boxers and greatly enjoyed owning an F800 GT, but they hadn't grabbed me like the RS has. Even though many of the adjectives I'd applied to the RS definitely characterized other bikes in my history, none of those had this magic either. In the psychology of perception, a Gestalt, a German term appropriately enough, is an experiential phenomenon wherein the whole is more than or different from the sum of its parts. This is separate from Gestalt therapy, which is a related but distinct theoretical orientation to treatment. It's an apt concept here, and it leaves more room than Pirsig does for an idiosyncratic vantage point. Maybe I just didn't fully appreciate the quality actually inherent in all those other motorcycles, but I find it more persuasive to incorporate something personal, more psychological and less philosophical, in reconciling my experience of the RS compared to all that came before it. It's possible the RS is the pinnacle of quality among the motorcycles I've sampled, but it's also possible it somehow pulls together more elements that resonate more precisely with my own personal preferences and ideals at a subconscious level. In other words, my perception of the bike's quality is partly a function of me, rather than strictly a function of the RS or any superordinate principle it embodies. It just happens to be best aligned with icons in the shadowy corners of my psyche. Of course, this is how I'd resolve the conceptual dilemma. I've solved the problem with typical Western dualism, splitting the event into object and observer. Pirsig and other monists would argue such a dichotomy is contrived, but I'm not facile enough to make their case here. I can offer this, however. Phenomenological psychology begins with the premise there is no object without an observer, attempting to heal the rift of Cartesian dualism by coming down squarely on the side of subjectivity, which is the basis of postmodernism's rejection of any ultimate objective truth or reality. This collapsing of the duality is the best I can manage without rereading Pirsig yet again. A person with zero knowledge of music theory can still recognize and be edified by the beauty of a well-done piece. Likewise, I don't need to be able to justify my enjoyment of the RS via any conceptual framework to feel ecstatic in its presence. In some way, that's exactly Pirsig's point, although it's also a rejection of his obsessional quest to systematize the principles involved. Perhaps with more time, I'll find I can articulate what it is about the RS I revere so highly. Until then, I'll just have to live with the enigma of its inscrutable, transcendent quality. There are worse fates.
The Bmw Moa Foundation is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit dedicated to improving rider safety by providing programs supporting motorcycling and its rich heritage. The Foundation's mission is built to provide and promote programs for first-time riders, with an emphasis on youth, women, and families, and to support a variety of educational and training programs related to safe motorcycling. The Foundation has two prominent programs, the Paul B. Scholarship and Safe Miles. The Paul B. Memorial Scholarship Fund honors the memory of Paul Bayshores, an avid motorcyclist with a big heart and a love for his BMW riding community. Paul B. Scholarship awards grants to individuals in the motorcycle riding community to help them pursue rider education and training. MOA members can receive up to a $250 grant for successfully completing any sanctioned motorcycle training course. Anyone who is not an MOA member can receive up to $100. Once you've scheduled and paid for your approved training course, submit your application to paulb@bmwmoaf.org. It's important to note the application must be submitted before the training course is completed. The MOA Foundation's Safe Miles program is in the process of establishing a $1 million endowment to fund the future of rider safety, education, and training. Donors to the Safe Miles Endowment receive special benefits like a 1-year renewal of their MOA membership, automatic entries to Foundation raffles, a donor dinner at the National Rally, a Foundation polo shirt, and more. Learn more and make your donation to the Foundation now by visiting the Foundation's website at bmwmoaf.org and clicking on Safe Miles.
As a way to begin maybe getting some clarification on what it is about BMWs, to paraphrase Melissa Holbrook Pearson, I thought we might begin with our very own Wes Fleming, who certainly has some bona fides in this regard. He is definitely a BMW guy in numerous ways. Wes, welcome to the podcast. And
thanks, man.
I hope you're prepared to shed light on this topic.
I will absolutely do my best.
All right. First, how about you tell everyone who maybe, surely people know some of what you're about to say as far as identifying yourself, but people may not be aware of how many different ways you are a Beamer guy. So let's just kind of run through a few of those. You have obviously owned BMWs. You have written about BMWs. You have worked on BMWs. You have interviewed people in the BMW community. You're a longtime MOA member, et cetera, et cetera. So please feel free to elaborate on those or fill in the blanks if I left something out.
No, I think you hit all the salient points. I was captivated by a BMW as a child when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. Now, at the time, I didn't even know it was a BMW. I didn't identify it as a BMW until much later, when I encountered a similar looking motorcycle and was able to play it back in my head. And in the intervening time, I had ridden other motorcycles that weren't BMWs. But once I got to BMW as a rider, I really haven't looked back. And I've had R bikes and I've had K bikes, and some of them I really liked and some of them I didn't like at all. And it's been a journey, learning to work on motorcycles started for me. Like I imagine it starts for a lot of people. I was relatively young and I was relatively broke. Or at least I was relatively cheap when it came to the idea of having to pay somebody else to fix something that I was absolutely convinced I could fix myself. And that's one of the things that I think is really important to a lot of people in the BMW community is the ability to do some of your own work, because that it becomes almost a shaming point when somebody talks about taking their bike to the dealer, and somebody will invariably chime in that discussion, whether it's online or in person. Well, you can change your own oil. Mm-hmm. Like, you can. Most people can. And I, at that time, had been probably by the 90s, by the late 90s, when I started riding BMWs, I was pretty comfortable working on my cars and trucks. But I never really did anything complicated. I wasn't much of a diagnostician. I was good at replacing what other people told me was broken. And then as I discovered, other people are not always as intelligent as you need them to be. A lot of times they are, but sometimes they aren't. And what they tell you is broken is not what's actually broken. It's just what they thought was broken. But those troubleshooting skills I kind of developed out of a necessity. And I still have blind spots and weaknesses and things like that. But, I think for at least when it comes to the kind of people that come to me for advice about their motorcycles, I can answer almost all the questions, because at least if I haven't done it, I've heard about it through my connection with my local dealer, who I get a lot of information from, and through my friend George, who runs an independent BMW repair shop, who I get a lot of experience through. I get to watch him and ask questions as he's fixing something. I don't actually fix customer motorcycles because I'm not covered by his insurance. So anytime you see me working on a bike, it's either my bike, my personal bike, or it belongs to a friend of mine, and I'm using it to make a video or something like that. Otherwise, I don't touch them because, liability is always a concern. But I think there's a certain amount of pride inherent in being able to work on your own motorcycle. And BMWs, while they've become more technologically advanced over the years, in the time period in which they kind of became established in the United States, they were pretty easy to work on. So we're talking like, the mid 70s through the mid 90s, the Airhead generation of motorcycles. And then that carried through into the late 90s and the early 2000s, where they were just kind of incrementally more complex, but still fairly easy to work on. And then we get into the 1200 generation of boxers, and then liquid cooled. And of course, the K bikes were always liquid cooled. And there were people, it's this little rivalry within the BMW community, which is a lot of fun. I see a parallel to it in the Harley community, where you've got Sportster people and people who will never ride a Sportster ever. Or, the folks that loved the V-Rod and the folks that hated the V-Rod.
Right.
That kind of plays over. And I think a lot of the iconic brands are like that. You don't really hear about Suzuki people arguing the merits of one bike versus the other. They just kind of get on the bike and disappear in a cloud of blue smoke.
Yeah. And so you're talking about this rivalry being between the K bike crowd and the R bike crowd. And I mean, does that extend also to the F bike and the G bikes? And
I don't think it does as much, because I think a lot of the times people who have been in on Team R bike for a long time, they just assume you're riding an F bike until you can buy a boxer. But as the F bikes have become larger displacement, with the parallel twin going from 700 to 800 to 850, it's become a viable long distance touring bike, especially the F850 GS or even the GS Adventure, which, you could take that bike pretty much anywhere for as long as you wanted to. It's all about how much you pack and how well you pack it. But I think the F bike riders consider themselves a little bit separate, just because, they don't have a boxer and they don't have not a boxer. You know what I mean? Like it used to be, it was a boxer or a inline 3 or 4.
Yeah. As a former F bike guy myself, in my very brief tenure owning, I've had 2 BMWs, and it turned out that I went from an F bike to an R bike. And now somehow I feel like I have a real BMW, or this is, I've graduated to the R bike from the F bike. And that's not based on me feeling like the F bike was a bad motorcycle. I really, really loved it. And anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked there, but so you were really talking about the way in which Beamers lent themselves to the home mechanics ministrations.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would say my impression has been that motorcycle people are more likely to work on their own machinery in general.
Yeah.
Than let's say the car people. I'd say a higher percentage of motorcyclists work on their own machinery as opposed to the percentage of car people who work on their own cars.
Yeah.
But you're saying this is even more true of BMW owners than it is among the general motorcycling population.
Yeah, I really do think it is. I don't know if it's a function of BMW putting a toolkit under the seat or the rider making sure they have a few tools to go along with them. I don't know. Out of all of the people that I ride with regularly, I don't know any of them who don't have at least a minimum toolkit with them on the bike, even if it's just a small underseat tire plugging kit and a pump at a minimum to make sure that you're not stranded on the side of the road by a flat. And it's a big discussion, but the other side of that is I also ride an Indian motorcycle, and I've spent a decent amount of time with those folks over the last 2.5 years. And the first question I got from one of them, I was taking stuff out of my saddlebag, was, why do you have a toolkit? Well, what do you mean? Why do I? Because I ride a BMW. This one isn't a BMW, but what kind of self-respecting BMW rider doesn't show up with a toolkit? It never occurred and the answer was, it never occurred to me to not have a toolkit on the motorcycle every time I leave my driveway.
Well, I would imagine that this is inextricably linked to the BMW owner's propensity to travel far and wide, and that being able to repair your bike, both have the tools and have the skills, that would be an extra high priority for people who are going to travel across country and be in areas where they would be forced to rely upon their own wits.
Yeah. I think there's probably a little bit of self-preferential bias, maybe, in that, we want to think of ourselves as more capable of dealing with problems that come up on the road as BMW riders. It's kind of like, well, I ride a BMW, I can handle this. But one of the reasons that I make sure I have tools is not just from experience, but from reading a book a long time ago. It's a book that most people that ride have heard of, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, right? Which the author says is not very factual about motorcycles or Zen. But one of the things that always stuck out in my mind was the BMW rider in his story, who is devoutly, almost steadfastly opposed to working on his own motorcycle. Like, he refuses to touch his own motorcycle except to ride it, and is, infuriated when it doesn't work properly. Where you have Persig, who is, tightening spokes and adjusting his chain and tweaking his engine and adjusting his carburetors all the way from Minneapolis to San Francisco. And he's on a Honda, right?
Honda, yeah.
Which is one of the right reasons why I wanted to ride a Honda, because I'm like, here's this guy who wrote this book that I have enjoyed. I didn't understand it, but I enjoyed it. And his protagonist is on a Honda. So I'm going to ride a Honda because I know that they're good bikes. And if it's good enough for him and he can work on it, I'm a pretty smart guy. It'll be good enough for me too. But yeah, he actively denigrates the BMW rider in the story, his friend from across the river, because he has no desire to understand the motorcycle.
Yeah, he has almost an anti-desire.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, a kind of repulsion.
Yeah,
to that kind of thing.
And I think because of the way that BMWs were back in that time period, they earned a reputation for being more reliable than other motorcycles, and that, you know, once a myth evolves, you know, and that myth of the bulletproof BMW that goes for thousands of miles, hundreds of thousands of miles, and never breaks down and never has a problem. It doesn't even matter if it's true, because that myth sells more motorcycles.
Yeah, there's an aura around the roundel.
Exactly. And Harley has their own mythology that's built up around them. There are a lot of people who buy a Harley Davidson because they literally cannot imagine riding any other motorcycle, and they don't know anything about riding motorcycles. They just know that they want to ride, and B, it has to be a Harley Davidson.
Right.
And that's it. They may not even understand why. And I think that part of my fascination with BMWs certainly came from reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and recognizing that there was a reliable BMW in the story, but also not wanting to be the object of derision by not understanding how the motorcycle works.
Right.
You know,
right.
And
you didn't want the Robert Pirsig in your head to scowl at you.
Right. And so I tend to naturally gravitate towards other people who reflect my desire at the time as a motorcycle rider, which is I want to ride a BMW and I want to understand how it works and I want to fix it myself. And I've done some pretty intense work on my own motorcycles. Replacing a dry clutch on a BMW is no joke. I mean, it is, it's a miserable piece of work. It takes hours and hours and hours to do. And it's messy and complex and involved, and invariably you will end up having to take the bike apart again because you forgot a bolt or a seal, or maybe that's just me. And it's a giant hassle, but I don't think I've ever been prouder of myself as a motorcyclist than the day I buttoned my motorcycle back up together after replacing the clutch and it worked.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It was much more fulfilling than just replacing a chain and sprockets.
Right. The arduousness of the task is part of what we base our subsequent pride on.
Yeah. And I think that another thing that BMW riders that draws us together is a little bit of exclusivity. You know, people like to feel special, and, you know, Harley Davidson sells 250,000 motorcycles a year or something like that. The vast majority in the United States. BMW sells 15,000 motorcycles a year in the United States. You know, and that's probably a high estimate. As a matter of fact, I know it's a high estimate. So there are a lot fewer of us than there are of them. And I think that's a really powerful thing that draws people together. So, you know, when we see another motorcycle at a gas station and we pull up at the pump and we look over and it's a guy on a Harley or an FJR or a KLR, we, you know, nod and wave and say, how you doing? And fill up our tank and close the cap and get on down the road a piece. But when it's another person on a BMW, I'm much more likely to pull up after I get my gas, take off my helmet, go over and start up a conversation, because I haven't seen a lot of other BMW riders out on the road. You know, I've seen plenty of sport touring bikes made by Japanese manufacturers. I've seen plenty of cruisers, Harleys, and now Indians are showing up more often. So there's a little bit of that that exclusivity of feeling special, like something other people don't know. And I get a little bit of that with the Indian community too, which is just starting to grow. And certainly I've even got a low run. I mean, I've got probably the least popular Indian that they invented, which is the FTR 1200. It's more of a naked sport bike and certainly not a cruiser. So even among the other Indian riders, yeah, I'm off on the fringe.
You could claim to be the elite within the elite.
Yeah. And I think it helps us in a lot of ways because it gives us our own little sense of community and creates a community within the community, right? So we have BMW riders, and then we also have GS riders, right, which are a big segment of the BMW community. And GS riders feel a little extra special because they have these multi-capable bikes. Like I'm really proud. I'm a little arrogant that I have a GS, right? Even though I never take it off road. And when I see somebody on a K1300 GT or even an R1250 RT, I'm like, yeah, it's a nice bike, but it's not a GS,
right?
The kind of thing.
If you had to, you could go down that Jeep road,
right?
But they couldn't, or at least not without serious risk of damaging
paint and
all
cracking
kinds
panels,
of plastic and so forth. Yeah.
And I think that there's something in all of us that wants to feel special and experience some exclusivity in our lives. And because BMW is a relatively low density motorcycle in the community, it helps us band together and support each other. And of course, that's just my layman's opinion.
Well, it certainly, it makes sense to me. I'm sure that the K bike owners look at the GS guys and
laugh.
Think about how much comfort you have sacrificed, or forfeited in your choice of motorcycle.
They always want to know when it comes to the competition between K bikes and boxers, the K bike riders always want to know what the R bike riders are trying to compensate for. And I think we all know what I intend or imply by that statement.
Sure. Well, the exclusivity of BMW, is an interesting aspect, because I would say there was a time when that exclusivity had something to do with BMWs being considerably more expensive than than the alternatives, at least, many of the alternatives. But the rest of the motorcycling world has caught up to BMW in terms of MSRPs.
Yeah.
And there's not the same kind of gap that there used to be. And so it's really not just about, I have an expensive motorcycle. This business about it being, a low density animal is, I think, probably more to the point these days.
Yeah. Yeah. And, certainly that's a really good point, because, for a lot of history, the equivalent BMW motorcycle has cost several $1,000s more than one from pretty much any other manufacturer. But BMW,
given up on a variety of performance metrics too.
Yeah.
For more money, you get less performance in some of the ways that, often attract attention on a spec sheet.
Right. And then, so now we've got Harley Davidson with their Pan America. And when they first announced it and the hype started to build, and I was very excited for the Pan America to come out. Harley made a liquid cooled adventure bike. That's really exciting. Everybody said it has to be at least as good as the GS, but it has to cost the same or less than the GS, or nobody will buy one. And wouldn't you know, when Harley comes out with it, they priced it really competitively compared to the GS. You get the one with all the bells and whistles on it, and it costs as much, maybe a little bit more a similarly equipped GS, but the base model is a little bit cheaper than a base model GS. So you can get a stripped down one for less than a GS. And, you know, you look at the horsepower and the torque and all that stuff, the ground clearance and, you know, all the things that matter to adventure bike riders. And it's very competitive on paper, but it's also very competitive when you get to the bank part of it. Right. And the flip side of that is BMW getting into Harley's corral with the R18 and really targeting cruiser riders in a really new way. And they did the same thing. You know, people said it has to be performance-wise, it has to be competitive, and price-wise, it has to be competitive. And BMW did the same thing with the R18 that Harley did with the Pan America. You know, they priced it right and they targeted it correctly. And they both really looked at the other person's model and said, we have to do what they do at least as well as they do it. Right. And I haven't ridden up Pan America yet, so I'm not personally, I don't know if Harley hit it, but I know BMW did.
Well, you know, this makes me think about, you know, we talk about BMW compared to other kinds of motorcycles. And the way in which BMW was able to, maintain this aura that we talked about a few minutes ago. Yeah. Despite the fact that it was more expensive and often, you know, did not have the kind of horsepower numbers or acceleration figures of competition, but people, and in fact also had some weird quirks. Those damn turn signals that you have to press with both thumbs, being, you know, just one. But people would not only put up with it, but, you know, that those things also became a kind of, you know, it became part of the cult following. Yeah. You know, to have these oddities about the motorcycle that you know, other people might raise an eyebrow at, but the true believers, you know, counted as features, not bugs. Yeah. And you know, so when I have an R1250RS now, and I would say, I mean, it is a thoroughly modern machine. There is, there's nothing about that bike that harks back to the days when BMW was a quirky machine with a quasi-agricultural motor and you know, maybe it would get you across the country and, you know, had reliability on its side. Maybe not. I mean, there's certainly been times when BMW's gotten tremendous bad press about certain kinds of problems that seem to infect a large number of their bikes. But anyway, you know, there's none of that with my bike. The turn signals work like they should. Yeah. And
it's one button.
And I mean, it certainly doesn't give up anything performance wise. It has, you know, a wonderful suspension. It has a tremendous engine and handling and thrust, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I guess, you know, I'd be tempted to say something like, it has become a Japanese motorcycle. And yet I would absolutely not say that. It is not a Japanese motorcycle. There is still something that sets it apart. And in the article I read at the beginning of this podcast, you know, I'm trying to figure out, so what is that quality? What is it that still sets it apart, even though in many regards, you know, the bike is more mainstream than ever? Yeah.
I think to a certain extent that it's also the riders. It's the people that choose to ride a BMW. You know, we as BMW aficionados, there's a lot of similarities in our group. And of course, there's always, life is a bell curve, and any social group is a bell curve. But, BMW riders tend to be a little more safety conscious, a little more training conscious, a little more gear conscious, which is not to say, I have a good friend who rides a Harley Davidson. And if we were standing next to each other in line somewhere in our motorcycle gear, you wouldn't be able to, you would probably peg me as the guy on the Harley and not him, just based on our gear. He's full textile, and I wear a nice leather jacket and riding jeans, and he's, head to toe in day glow, but that sense of community develops through a lot of things. And I think the bike is just the tool to join the community, if that makes sense. You're kind of finding your people, and we're BMW people. Somewhere along the line, we identify other BMW people. I'm not sure how that happens, but that's kind of your job to tell people how that happens. I'm just trying to find the way to say it in BMW speak, I guess.
Right. Well, I'm not going to let you steer clear of my question that easily.
Okay.
I am still going to ask you about the bikes themselves. However, let's just for a moment, let's stick with the BMW riders.
Okay.
And you mentioned these things which you've come to believe are some defining characteristics, or at least some changes in emphasis between BMW riders and the rest of the motorcycling community. And I could maybe find a red thread through the things you said and call it something like BMW riders are a more cerebral group.
Oh, we'd like to think so, wouldn't we?
Well, I don't know. I mean, my stereotype before I really invaded this community a couple years ago, I knew some BMW riders, and I certainly had talked to many over the years. I never had a BMW rider as a riding buddy, though. So, my image of BMW riders was in large part based on fantasy, not reality. But yeah, I would have said that the stereotypical BMW rider was a crusty old engineer who wanted to just ride perpetually and had no concern with fashion or the quarter mile times or anything other than function.
Yeah.
Like, they were really a purist as far as, I want the thing that works, and I don't care what it looks like. I don't care how fancy it is, or whether it makes headlines on the drag strip, or that. I want the thing that really works. And, I want the thinking man's motorcycle, or thinking woman's motorcycle. And I mean, how close is that to reality? Is that anywhere near what you were saying?
Mark, stereotypes exist for a reason. And certainly that's a good one. And I think that the people who are perhaps the most vocal BMW fans are either those people or they would like to be those people. But that's kind of where the myth starts, right? Because, I want to ride what an engineer relies on, because I don't want it to break down. And I want to, even if I'm not going to ride around the world, I want to ride a bike that I know could go around the world. And in my mind, that's going to be a BMW, you know?
Well, and that's no more removed from reality than the person who chooses the sport bike because it's got the fastest quarter mile time. Yep. It's not like they're ever going to actually achieve that quarter mile time as a non-professional test rider. But they want the bike that they believe can do it. It's this sort of, I want the one that has the potential for that, even if I'm not going to realize it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so maybe in a certain way I don't want to say fooling ourselves, because that sounds negative, but perhaps we want to associate ourselves with an image that we admire, because then it helps us be, or at least see ourselves as the person that we want to be as a motorcycle rider, if that makes sense.
No. Yes. Easily.
Yeah. And that's that. I have this fantasy of, selling everything and riding my motorcycle from one end of the earth around the rest of it and back to that point. And, being that person who rode around the world. I know in my heart, I know I'm never going to do that, but that's a big part of why I still ride a GS,
Yeah. Well, there's another version of that, and it's not about a sort of, a fantasy of what you might do one day. And I can tell you, when I'm on my old F800 GS too, I felt the same thing, that when I'm on a BMW, in that moment, because of something I'm still struggling to define, there's something about that makes me feel like I am a better motorcyclist because I'm connected to this bike right now.
Yeah.
And it's not dependent on whether I ever utilize all of the strengths that the bike possesses. Is that there is something about being in contact with this piece of machinery that is really thoughtfully designed and, does so much effortlessly that makes me feel like I'm that well designed, or I'm that powerful or graceful, or, fill in the blank, whatever the right word would be. And it's in the moment. It's not something that I'm imagining, at some point in the future.
Yeah.
So where does that come from?
It might be as simple as the feedback that we get from the motorcycle. I know from my experience, having ridden a series of Japanese bikes that I really liked. I was a big fan of the CB750, and I rode more modern Japanese inline fours. I had a Suzuki Bandit 1200 that was a phenomenal motorcycle, and I loved it. I really did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But likewise, I've had 30 some motorcycles of other brands, and many of which were, I would have given them lots of praise and really enjoyed them, but they didn't do this.
Yeah, they didn't. And I never felt the way about my Bandit the way I do about my even my current BMW that I've only had for 8 months. When I crashed my Bandit out in Oregon and it was totaled, it didn't bother me. And maybe part of that is because a Suzuki Bandit is not quirky. I knew I could go to a Suzuki dealership and buy another one exactly like it, and it would be exactly like it. Mm. But every BMW I've owned is a different motorcycle, and it has its own characteristics. Even when I had two different R1100 GSs, one that was built in 1995 and one that was built in 1998. And even though they looked the same and they were, you know, functionally the same, they were different motorcycles. And, you know, one of them liked to rev hard and shift high, and the other one didn't like that quite as much. And I had to learn how to ride that bike. And I guess knowing how to ride that specific motorcycle rather than every one just like it made me feel like I was part of the process. Like I was part of the machine itself. The machine and I became one, where, you know, with my Bandit, my CB750s, it was just me on a motorcycle.
There wasn't the same engagement or relationship between you and the machinery.
Yeah. And I'm not sure where that can be. Maybe that's part of the magic, you know, and maybe that's part of why, you know, BMW still continues to be one of the premium brands in the world, even though they don't sell a huge number of motorcycles, especially in the United States, is just because of that intangible connection that most BMW riders seem to form with that motorcycle. You know, I never used to have trouble selling motorcycles until I started riding BMWs. And then I had trouble. I've had a difficult time selling every BMW I've ever sold.
You mean difficulty letting go of it?
Yeah, exactly. Difficulty letting go of it. I've never, and that's kind of the upside. I've never had a problem selling one. I've always been able to sell them fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. But from a personal standpoint, they were always hard to let go. And, you know, I never watched anybody drive off with a CB750 that I sold them. But I have never not watched anybody drive off with a BMW I sold them, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And kind of gone, and immediately in the moment, man, should I really have sold that bike? You know, I could have done this, or I could have done that. You know, I felt like maybe I let the motorcycle down a little bit, which is a weird thing, you know. But yeah, there's. You know,
I would say I've had that experience with my. Almost all of my European motorcycles, but not my Japanese motorcycles.
Yeah.
And now I've only sold one BMW so far, and I had just acquired the other. So, you know, maybe I would have felt even more of what you're talking about as I watched the F800 be carried off.
Yeah.
If I didn't have the RS sitting there in my garage to comfort me.
Yeah, you were still in the honeymoon phase with the RS. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'll find out if I can do that better. If in the near future, if I decide to sell the Indian, will I feel as bad about it as I have about selling my BMWs? And you know, the funny thing is I have no doubts that if you and I were Harley people, that we could be having this exact same conversation. And instead of saying BMW, we could say Harley Davidson, you know, because my brother-in-law rides a Harley and he can't imagine riding any other bike. You know, when
I'm sure you're right.
You know, and he loves his Harley, and it doesn't have, even when it's acting up, he doesn't have anything negative to say about it. He's like, well, you know, I could probably fix it. It's just it's a glitch. It's not a big deal. And I'm like, dude, your garage floor is covered with oil. What do you mean it's just a glitch? And he's like, oh no, it's just that's a minor leak. And I've had that leak too. You know, or
Wes, my cat is has just entered the room and is crying. I know it's going to come through on the mic.
That's okay. I can hear it.
Yeah, give me just a moment to
see what's going on with
put him somewhere else. I'm sorry.
Sure. Don't sweat it. So yeah, you know, my brother-in-law and his Harley, he has the same relationship with his Harley that I have with my GS. And I don't understand it because I'm not a Harley guy. And, he works on BMWs. He's a professional motorcycle mechanic, and he works on BMWs from time to time. And he's like, yeah, they're marvels of modern engineering, and I wouldn't ever own one, because he's a Harley guy.
Yeah, there are other criteria.
Yeah, yeah. And whatever his criteria are, I don't understand. And what mine are, he doesn't understand. It's that magic, and maybe it's as simple as I lived in Germany from age 7 to age 11. And most of the motorcycles I saw were BMWs, and that somehow just imprinted on my psyche in an unconscious fashion to where I would never be satisfied unless I was on a BMW. Where a lot of American kids grow up and, people talk about their Harley or their dad's Harley, or the guy down the street has a Harley, or, whatever it is that just grabs you when you're a kid. If you become aware of motorcycles like that, it's a and this, right? You're a professional, mind person. The mind is a really bizarre and unpredictable thing. And especially once we, I think, become adults and we start to identify with our people, we tend to reinforce that self-identification with our choices in life.
Sure.
So
and it becomes hard to know which is cause and which is effect.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would, I think what you just said makes perfect sense. But it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work to explain my experience, because I was aware of BMWs over the many decades that I've been a motorcyclist.
Right.
And I would have even said, because I've ridden some without owning them, and I love the Boxer motor. I would have said it was on my bucket list to own a Boxer at some point, but I didn't have that same kind of, aspiration to, like, BMW was going to be the promised land for me.
Yeah.
Like it was for you. And yet, nevertheless, once I got a hold of one, I felt like I had reached the promised land.
Yeah.
Now, so I'm back around to there. Maybe it's the wrong question to ask. I keep asking, what is it about the BMW that is creating this experience in me? And of course, it could be that it's not exactly in the motorcycle, but it is some way in which this motorcycle harmonizes, resonates with some set of preferences within me, and it just does so better than previous motorcycles. And that, is more of a reflection on my own idiosyncratic tastes than it is some aspect of BMW. But
yeah, because if you had ridden an R1100 RS in 1997, it may not have resonated with you like the 1250 RS did, because in 1997 you were a completely different person and you had a different body of experience behind you than you've been able to add in the last 25 years. So you're a different person, and so.
And the motorcycle has evolved as well.
Exactly. So maybe what it is that, BMW's engineering and Mark's personal development converged in 2021, whereas BMW's engineering and Wes's development converged in 1999. Not to say that I'm, more advanced than you are. I'm just saying.
Well, but that is what you're saying.
Well, it was a lower level of engineering, right? The bikes are more sophisticated now. You're more sophisticated now.
Good save. Good save.
Yeah. Well, they tell you when you find out that you're in a hole, you need to stop digging.
Well, that may be as far as we can go with this.
It might be.
I appreciate your insight, and I don't know if you have some other thoughts you were hoping to get to before we called it a day here. But
I think I'm good, man.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to give up on boiling down the essence of BMW machinery. But it really may be too simplistic a way to frame the question.
Maybe. Well, we'll keep working on it. We'll try to figure it out.
All right. Well, there are certainly less fun questions to try to answer.
Yep.
I'll take it. All right. Well, thank you very much for being with us.
Anytime, man. I'll talk to you again soon.
All right.
We'd love to answer your questions too, so send them to podcast@bmwmoa.org. Visit our website at therideinside.com to listen to every episode of the podcast and read more of Mark's writing on various motorcycle-related topics. The best way to support The Ride Inside is by joining the BMW Motorcycle Owners of America. Yes, it says BMW right in the name, but we absolutely do not care what bike you ride. We know what's most important. The MOA is all about the community of riders, not a single brand. You can join as a digital member for $39 a year, or as a traditional member for $49 a year. The biggest difference is digital members don't get a hard copy of the monthly magazine in their mailbox. They access the BMW Owners News online. Each membership supports digital offerings like the Ride Inside, as well as everything else the MOA does. Find out more at bmwmoa.org. Ride along with us on the internet. The MOA and all its digital productions are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll see you out there somewhere on the road, or off it. Ride safe.